Konstantin Stanislavski was a directing and acting teacher who lived from 1863 to 1938. So think of him as around the turn into the 1900s here. It's primarily when he was coming to prominence, and he was Russian. He worked at the Moscow Art Theater, and he was an extremely good director, and he set down a system of actor training that will become very important in the 20th century and even today into the 21st century. The Stanislavski system, which he developed, emphasizes realistic human behavior on stage. This is where we first start to see the turn into realistic acting and away from that declamatory style of acting that we'd had before. It de-emphasized the actor's ego in favor of playing a realistic character who remained behind what we call the fourth wall. The fourth wall is an invisible wall between the actors and the audience. And it is a wall that Stanislavski insisted his actors break, not interact with the audience, not look at the audience. Stanislavski wanted you to pretend the audience was not there. So in the Stanislavski system, the characters, unlike in Shakespeare, never address the audience. They stay behind the fourth wall, they remain in their own little world, and they talk to one another. Shakespeare often had his characters breaking the fourth wall and talking to the audience and interacting with them, style that we still use today. Often audiences really like this when the actors turn to them and speak and say something. But in true realism, the characters don't do that because the characters don't know that they think they're in their living room at home talking to each other. They don't know there's an audience watching them. In the Stanislavski system, Stanislavski divided what the character wants into two terms, which he called the superobjective and the objective. And they're very similar. They both refer to what the character wants. But the superobjective is simply what the character wants over the entire course of the play, so it's the larger goal, the larger objective, while the objective itself is what the character wants in each scene or each section of. So your objective might change over the course of a scene, but for the most part you might have one or maybe two objectives that change in a scene. Now, so we have to look at what the character wants over the entire play. Oedipus the King is a really good example of this because it's very, very clear. In plays today, it's often not clear, and the actor has to work a lot harder to figure out what does this person want over the entire course of the play. And again, you want to stick with active kinds of words. You might say that you don't want to say Oedipus wants to be happy because that's passive. He wants to be something. So you want something the actor can play. You can't play those to be verbs, to be angry, to be happy, to be sad. What would make him happy is the next question. Of course, we all want to be happy. So it's too vague, it's too general, but you can say something really specific. Oedipus wants to save his city from the plague. Or you can say, Oedipus wants to save his city from the plague by discovering who killed the king. And that's even more specific, really. So that's a great way to look at super objective. So when the actor gets into the individual scenes, he or she will also want to have an objective. So figuring out what that character wants at each moment in the play and proceeding from there, that's going to help you choose your tactics. So if we look at a scene like Oedipus twisting the messenger's arm and demanding information from him, that's very active, to demand. We could say he's doing a couple of different things here, which would be his tactics, the action that he's playing. He's demanding, he's investigating, he's threatening. All of those are things that actor can physically do on stage. And that's important because if you can't physically do it on stage, if you can't do it to another person on stage in that sense, then it's not a good tactic. Now, why is he choosing those tactics? That has to do with his scene objective. He's choosing those tactics because he's trying to get information. He wants to get information. That's his objective, but the tactic is how you specifically play the objective. Am I going to demand, beg, plead, threaten, investigate? How am I going to get this particular information? And the more tactics you have at your disposal, the better, because that's how you pursue your objective. The magic if is a term that we use in actor training to talk about imagination. And this is one of the ways that you can train your mind to imagine what the character is going through. It allows the actor to project him or herself into the play and to understand what the character is experiencing at that moment. We don't always have the same experiences as the character, and in a lot of plays you don't have the same experiences as the character because the character is going through some very terrible things. That's what plays are. So you have to imagine, you have to put yourself into that situation, and you can say, if I were in this position, how would I respond to this? If I were in this situation, how would I feel and act? And that's your magic if. So you're using yourself, you're using your own experience, disregarding the fact that you might not have had the same background as the character, the same given circumstances. You might not have been through what the character's been through, but you can always say, but if it were me, how would I feel about this, and what would I do, and what would I think? And then you might discover, oh, I would do something very different than what this character does. Or I would hope I would, because you never know. But I would hope I would not do what Oedipus does if I were in a situation. Always allowing for the fact that you might. Subtext is the unspoken meaning under the words. So what's really going on in the scene? That's what I always ask as a director. If we have a scene and it's in the play, then I know it's important and I know it means something. And if it doesn't, it's not a very well-written play. If it's really just there for kind of, oh, to cover a scene change, or occasionally you see those things where you think, I think the playwright might have written this just because someone has to change clothes. But you still have to figure out why it's there and why it's important and why you're showing it to the audience. Otherwise, we should just lose it. The subtext is what gives the audience the idea of what's really happening in the scene. So take, for example, if you have a scene with a father and a young boy, and the father is helping the young boy tie his shoes. So you say, well, that's just, kind of a moment in life that happens, and it's very sweet, whatever. But if you think of it in those terms, you're not thinking of it as important enough. Why is it in the play? Why are we seeing it? What does it represent? Maybe it doesn't really advance the story. So what's it about? It's about character development. It's about relationship. It's about how this father interacts with this child. It's about a moment perhaps that this kid is always going to remember. So you have to come up with, as the director and as the actor, with ways that justify this is important enough to show to your audience. And that will help you play those moments. So here's an example of subtext. If I come into a classroom and I say, good morning, class, today we'll be discussing action. That's one feeling. Maybe you think, okay, this is a person who's trying to get some energy up and is trying to capture the audience's attention, who maybe those things translate into, I hope, somebody who cares about the class and about what they're doing. You get a very different idea if the person comes in and says, good morning, class. Today we'll be talking about action. So in that sense, I think you get the feeling that maybe the person doesn't care about what they're doing. They're just here to get through the day. They really don't give a care about what they're about to say to the class, right? So very different kinds of impressions and subtext, and that's very broad, a very broad example, but I think it's a good one to have you kind of remember subtext. You can change the meaning of the playwright's words by changing the subtext, and that's frightening for playwrights. Think about what a frightening position that is to be in as a playwright. Depending on how the actor says it, it will mean different things. Realistic drama is actually driven by subtext, while Shakespeare has very little subtext. The characters tend to say exactly what they're thinking. If they say, "Oh, I am out of breath in this fawn chase," as Helena does in A Midsummer Night's Dream, she means I am out of breath. I can't catch my breath. I've been running around the woods. She's not trying to cover that up. Often in Shakespeare, the characters are speaking to the audience. So it's not always true that when a character is speaking to the audience, they're being truthful, but often that's the case. Realistic drama is more like daily life. It's meant to reflect daily life it's a type of style that we'll get to later in the semester when we talk about realism. And it's meant to show us what daily life is like for people. And so in daily, people often cover things up and don't say what they mean and mislead you for their own purposes, right? And that does happen in Shakespeare as well, but it's much, much more driven by subtext. Realism is much more driven by subtext than something like Shakespeare.